Hello, everyone. We're delighted you're joining us to talk about annuities at the crossroad of growth and compliance. Let's now move forward to introduce our lovely panelists.
Hi, everybody. My name's Issa Hanna. I'm a partner at the Eversheds Sutherland Law Firm. I'm a member of our investment services and products team. We're a regulatory team supporting broker-dealers, investment advisors, insurance distributors, and other intermediaries in the financial services space, and happy to be here today.
Thank you, and Brian.
Just in the order of loveliness, I am Brian Rubin. I'm a partner of ISAs. I'm based in the DC office. I'm co-head of the Securities Enforcement Group, and I primarily work with firms being examined and investigated by the SEC, FINRA in the States. And before my current life, I was in enforcement at both the SEC and NESD.
Thank you, and Rob.
Hi, I'm Rob Dearman. I'm the founder and chief innovation officer for DCG Insight, a strategic consultancy for broker-dealers, RIAs, TAMPs, and fintech firms. I'm not a colleague of Brian and Issa's. I'm just an admirer of their work. I used to serve on FINRA's FinTech Innovation Board, also on FINRA's CIO board, and have worked with the SEC and the DOL on various initiatives. In my past life, I was the founder and CIO of the country's third largest independent broker-dealer network, where I was also the president of wealth management, and then also the founder of a TAMP. And then in the end of my life in the corporate world, I was the head of platform strategy for Jackson, the variable annuity manufacturer. I spend a lot of my time at the intersection of technology, compliance, and operations.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome, Tom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Reeve. I'm the product lead here at InvestorCom. Spend my time working with clients on helping them solve all sorts of problems and help them kind of grow across annuity, rollover, and other recommendations. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Tom. And folks, my name is Parham. I'll be moderating today's conversation. If you haven't come across InvestorCom on our platform, in the market, we're known for being proudly simple and taking a lot of these complex requirements from a regulatory perspective and injecting suitability and best interest into that investment proposal process. With that said, let's hop into our agenda for today, and then we'll jump into a bit of a poll. We're going to start by looking at the 800-pound gorilla in the room. What's the reason behind the growth in the annuities market? We'll then intersect that with the specific cases and why annuities are under regulatory scrutiny, which I'm sure a lot of people here are here to hear from our expert panelists. And finally, we'll draw from our expert panelists on their wisdom as it relates to practical next steps. How can our clients build a defensible process that meets the regulatory scrutiny requirements? And as I said earlier, we've got a dedicated time for any questions that may pop up throughout today's conversation. Excellent. Let's dive in with our first poll question, which really talks to your firm's strategy around annuity growth. We know that annuities market and annuity sales are increasing. What is your respective view on that growth today? Give this 30 more seconds. Just going to pop the results on the screen for everybody. And as you guessed it, at least the folks who are attending this session, a lot of folks, 55% are actively growing this annuity side of the business. Some see the opportunity but have not scaled it, which is great conversation piece for today. And then others are expanding or looking to explore the segment. Thank you all. We'll have more of these poll questions throughout today's conversation. All right. Uh, Let me close this. Rob, if it's okay with you, I'm going to start with your background, given what you're seeing in the marketplace. You, as you said, you led Jackson National. You're seeing the structural shift today. What's the root cause? Client demand, aging demographics? What are your thoughts?
Can't help but look back, right? And look at the trends over history, because I've had a front row seat for three of these booms. Building product on the manufacturing side at Jackson when we were in the VA rider arms race, and then kind of watching the fallout land on advisors' desks when I was on the distribution side of the network, and 2330s and all the 1035 exchange regulatory change started happening. The interesting thing is that every prior boom was sort of a one variable story. In the 2000s, this was riders, it was features. In 22 and 23, it was rates, the MIGA boom. Here's the tell that this cycle is different. The variable changed, but the boom didn't stop. The Fed started cutting rates in late 24. The rate trade died, but the industry still set its fourth straight record, 464 billion in 25 per LIMRA. Demand simply rotated into protected growth. LIMRA frames it perfectly. RILAs and FIAs are now 42 cents of every annuity dollar versus under 30 cents a decade ago. Why is it not going to stop? Two structural facts. First, demographics. You just had up on the slide, roughly 11,000 Americans are turning 65 every day through 27. And for most of them, the pension's a museum piece. Second, and this is the part that a lot of people miss, the sellers changed. There's a great Harvard Business School study recently talks about private equity-backed insurers. They went from 7% of new fixed and index sales in 2011 to, this may shock you, 35% today. When I was at Jackson, we managed products against a risk budget, statutory capital reserves, and all of the Greeks. But with a private equity owned owner, they're asset managers. They need premium to feed their investment engines. And supply is going to chase this demand aggressively, whether advisors are ready for it or not. So, why is this a technology story? Because the bottleneck moved from product to plumbing. Industry surveys are showing that only about 7% of financial professionals write annuities at any meaningful rate, but 90% say they do more if the experience weren't painful. And when someone actually removes the pain, watch what happens. I'll give you one small example. DPL tripled its platform assets in about 2 years just by making annuities fit inside the RIA's normal workflow. Same product, better plumbing, triple the flow. So the soundbite here is the annuity industry is no longer has a demand problem or a product problem. It's got a user experience problem. 464 billion happened despite the workflow. Imagine what happens when the workflow catches up.
Wow. Well said, Rob, and thank you for starting us off with so much energy. Isa, Mike is going to get passed your way next. Obviously, you work with many broker-dealers, insurers, distributors. From where you sit, is the caution winning?
Um, I'd say there's definitely real interest. I think that was reflected in the results from the poll question that was just posed to the audience a bit ago. But I think given some recent developments in terms of new product types, different product features, the complexity of the products out there, and just how popular these products have gotten recently, and how they've kind of caused regulators to start to pay a little bit more attention and ask some more questions about them. I'd say there's both interest in kind of exploring these and being a bit more cautious about how to go about it. I'd say, just coming back to the product, variation, you'll see now in the market there are like different flavors of the product. Like for example, like brokerage and advisory versions of different types of annuities to go through, both types of channels. Obviously, the brokerage channel has been around and has been the traditional channel for some time, but the advisory channel is more of a relatively recent development, and having both of those types of products at your disposal, um, is great from a flexibility perspective, but it does open up the issue of essentially like an account type or gating type of consideration where there's an expectation that you should be thinking through, okay, well, for this particular client, would it be in their best interest to buy, a commission-based version of this product, and take it on in a set it and forget it type of relationship, or do they need an ongoing relationship with respect to the product? Would it be a better idea for them to hold this in as part of our investment advisory relationship? Do they have a documented need for that ongoing advice? Is that enough to justify the additional fees that they'd be paying on an ongoing basis on top of the product level charges, and that type of thing? So, those are the types of things you'd want to think about in a brokerage versus advisory scenario. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in these products from registered investment advisors. They're definitely looking to just enhance their relationship with their clients by offering these as part of like a holistic financial planning type of delivery model, right? To meet all the needs of the client from an asset protection and a legacy planning perspective. But when you do that as an RIA, there are a few big things to think about, like insurance producer licensing. Do you have the license necessary in order to recommend these products, or do you need to work with some sort of outside insurance desk before you go down that road? Are you scoping, the recommendation of the product into your investment advisory relationship unintentionally and creating a fiduciary duty with respect to that recommendation that you might not necessarily intend? Are your overall fees reasonable in light of your Advisors Act fiduciary duty to think about, stacking an advisory fee on top of the product level fees? And then, are you adequately addressing conflicts of interest to meet those fiduciary duties under the Advisors Act? So these are things that you definitely want to think about if you're an investment advisor looking to get into this space.
Wow. Well done, Isa. Thank you. Um, I hope folks wrote those down because we're going to just go a little bit deeper into this. Brian, obviously everyone's double clicked on the fact that there is incredible growth in the marketplace. Um, Curious what you see as potential gaps as you're working with your clients in this front.
Yeah, so growth is obviously important. It's not the whole issue. The exposure arises where firms just aren't keeping up with the growth. So there are a few trends that sort of stand out. As we talked about, volume is outpacing a lot of things, and that includes infrastructure at some firms. So some firms' supervisory frameworks were really built for significantly lower volume. So there's increasing demands on review, escalation, exception management, and oversight processes. And in terms of the gaps that we've seen, there are a number, and we'll talk about them today. So one of them is surveillance, which remains to be a key regulatory focus. There's 2330, which requires surveillance procedures dealing with exchanges, and a recurring theme that we've seen in both exams and enforcement actions involves firms that review transactions individually, but lack surveillance designed to identify elevated exchange rates, repeat replacements, concentration trends, or representative specific patterns. So effective supervision increasingly requires firms to identify broader themes. Another issue is WSPs and principal reviews. So WSPs often describe the regulatory requirements, but doesn't really operationalize them. So gaps include not defining the criteria, having unclear escalation processes, or inconsistent documentation of surrender charges, for example, or lost benefits, or rider features, replacement considerations. And then the principal reviews aren't sufficiently documenting or explaining why they agreed and approved with the recommendation being in the customer's interest. And then RILAs, as Rob said, that's really an emerging frontier, very rapid growth. FINRA Rule 2330 only applies to deferred variable annuities, but both FINRA and the SEC are focusing on firms that sell RILAs, what their supervision is, training, documentation, and review controls. So the regulators are really focusing on this increased demand, increased sales, and whether the firms are keeping up with the basic frameworks that they're expecting.
That's fantastic, Brian. Obviously, you've identified a few gaps which we'll kind of drill into as we go throughout today's conversation. And speaking of drilling deeper, Tom, obviously we sit on top of a significantly large volume of both rollover recommendations and annuity recommendations. From what you've seen on the product front, what patterns are emerging to you?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different directions. At a high level, I think, what we've heard today, a lot of the growth is concentrated in these kind of high compliance risk areas, complex products like RILAs and even fixed index annuities, that are really difficult to understand for everyone from the advisors who are, making these recommendations up to kind of supervision teams and home offices. Um, you know, Exchanges in how to properly both enable the advisor to recommend and analyze exchange scenarios, but also, of course, supervise them. And then really, as Rob mentioned, there's sort of this latent demand for more annuity recommendations to be made. And so we hear a lot about how to kind of enable advisors to understand and be able to safely, with the right guardrails, make recommendations for these products, and make that process more efficient to meet that latent demand. Um, the last thing I think, we're uniquely positioned with a lot of kind of rollover activity through our platform. Um, the demand for sort of lifetime income and annuities as a puzzle piece in the the total financial picture is super high, and so we are seeing huge amounts of flows from rollover dollars directly into annuity product recommendations. I think some clients as high as sort of a third from a frequency percentage basis. And this makes it super important for firms and their advisors to document both advice layers, whether or not to actually roll those assets, and then which annuity product or which product in general um, should I be recommending. And so, we view it as a really important, part of this strategy to kind of combine and have visibility into both those layers of advice.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Um, a couple of quick points. I see folks who have their hands up in the chat inbox. Please perhaps just write down your questions, and we're curating all these questions and comments you might have, and we plan to take them up and throughout today's conversation. Specifically, we've got the last 15 minutes focused on tackling those. Uh, Tom, you mentioned a couple of things, and Rob, I want to piggyback off of one of the comments you made early on around advisor or workflow solutions related to annuity recommendations. Obviously, so far we're hearing RILAs, RILAs, RILAs. Tom just touched on rollover recommendations, folks taking funds out of their 401k plans at the time of retirement, funneling them into annuities Curious what your ideal circumstance would be if all of those pieces were optimized.
Yeah, let's make it tangible because I spend a lot of time with firms trying to create one really simple, really congruent digital end-to-end experience. Open the BD account or open the advisory account and then flow right into gathering the data we need on a proposal, a financial plan, an annuity order entry platform, all the way through. And back in the day at Jackson, the product spec for a fixed annuity fit on an index card. And so solving that problem was a lot easier. Here's your rate, here's your schedule, done. Even though a non-registered product had a fake QSIP sometimes, there were still barriers to jump over, but it was relatively easy. But today, let's just take a RILA. RILA is a derivatives book wearing an insurance wrapper. Like one carrier who shall remain nameless, their latest launch came with more than 50 strategy combinations, dual directional crediting, where your client makes money in a modestly down market. That went from one carrier's clever idea in 2020 to roughly 1/5 of RILA premiums at some shops. And per LIMRA, RILA's passed traditional VAs in 2024 for the first time ever. So the systems that we used to design, the user experience we used to design is not good enough anymore. Um, because this is the center of registered product market now. It's not the fringe. So what that does to infrastructure and usability design, I lived this earlier, a milder version of this when we had several thousand reps at NPH. But FINRA's 2026 oversight report flags something that most supervisory systems literally cannot even see: interim value. So if you recommend a mid-segment withdrawal or surrender without evaluating the interim value risk, that alone might be a Reg BI concern. And they've extended their exchange warnings, as Brian indicated, from VA to RILA to now RILA to RILA. So stop and think about what that means technologically and operationally. Your supervision system, and sometimes your annuity order entry or account opening system, now needs to know what day of the segment your client is on. A paper file or a PDF does not know that. It cannot be queried, even with AI, to be real-time interim value specific. Only structured data, a real, near real-time curated product master is going to know that. So even the SEC concluded that the old plumbing couldn't describe this product. They rebuilt the entire registration regime and moved every RILA onto Form N4 by May 26. And the conversion wave exposed just how fragmented carriers' own product data still is. Even the manufacturers are having to re-architect their masters. So if the regulator had to re-architect for RILAs, so does your firm. Soundbite on this one, Param. If your supervisory system can't tell the difference between a 10% buffer and a 10% floor, then you're not supervising, you're just archiving.
Love it. Love it. Hey, you've heard it here first, hopefully. Maybe this is good fodder for us to jump into our second poll question. So, where is your firm most exposed uh, to the growth versus control tension? Is it the product rider complexity? Is it replacements and annuity exchanges? Cross-channel consistency between, I believe Issa touched on it. Are you an RIA? Are you an independent broker dealer? Is it the advisor workflow solutions? Should we take a quiz from our panelists? What do you all think as folks are addressing these?
I don't know. Should we
Vote
should we
A
should
and
we
B.
lodge a guess as to what would be the
Yes,
most popular?
yes is a good thing. Yeah.
I think it's gonna be B.
I vote A and B.
I think it's going to be B, but it should be data, data, data.
You guys are expanding the poll suggestions. Let me just share the results, and you will see that Isa will give you the award here for winning picking replacements. But
I
I think
I might have
everybody.
I might have juiced the results. Sorry.
This is great insight. I think this is great insight, especially as we get into The second segment of our panel discussion here today on annuities. Specifically, let me jump in and talk a little bit about.
Well, she actually predicted that as well. So,
There we go. Prediction markets are attending our webinar. This is lovely. Um, so I think, Rob, you touched on FINRA's exam and oversight report. SEC's has flagged similar elements around exchanges, concentrations, surrender of recommendations, and overall weak supervision. So maybe this is a good opportunity for us to drill down. And Brian, you sat on both sides, as you said in your introduction, both on the enforcement front as well as on the regulatory front. Across the actions you're seeing from SEC, FINRA, and state, what are the common patterns that show up in your opinion?
the one common pattern with 20 subparts is the choice that was picked out by the fans in the audience today, exchanges. So that is where we see most of the issues, most of the concerns. And when I was in the enforcement side years ago, that was an issue, maybe not as significant as it is now, but certainly that's the issue now. So the cases frequently turn on the gap between the sales story, why the sale was made, versus the documentary evidence of it. And financial professionals are interviewed on the record testimony. Principals also give on the record testimony, and there's often a gap. So we can focus on a few things here. One is the transaction itself raises multiple regulatory concerns at once. So you're often dealing with a customer who's a retiree or near retiree, and with an exchange, you're triggering possibly surrender charges, new expenses, new commission opportunities, and the customer may also be giving up valuable features like living benefits, death benefits, or favorable contract terms. So the regulators immediately focus on the benefits of the new product and whether those justify the costs and the trade-offs. Then the next issue to focus on that's important is 2330, as we talked about. So evaluating the various issues, including the surrender charges, lost benefits, increased costs, prior exchanges within 36 months. And under Reg BI, it's not enough just to simply describe the features of the replacement. So the firm and the rep have to demonstrate why the recommendation was in the customer's best interest. And then we also see supervisory weaknesses that often accompany problematic exchanges. So we're talking about inadequate exchange surveillance, we're talking about ineffective principal review, or procedures that really don't give meaningful guidance on evaluating cost benefits and alternatives. The regulators expect firms to document genuine customer specific comparisons and not just sort of conclusory justifications after the fact. So that's the biggest area.
All right. Glad we're recording this, Brian, because we can share some of these notes with folks. That's an alarming list of items for folks to keep on top of. Speaking of which, one of the common cases, and we'll kind of jump into individual cases as we go throughout this conversation, but the case that's kind of has come across the most across our client base has been the Cutter case. Can you shed a little bit of light? Why is this case particularly significant, and maybe share your views on it?
Sure. And we won't name a lot of cases. I think this will be the only one that we'll actually call out by name. But there was a fair amount of controversy around Cutter. I don't think the controversy was fair, and I think in some respects it was sort of made up for marketing purposes for some folks. But in March of 2023, the SEC sued a Massachusetts investment advisor, Jeffrey Cutter, and his firm, alleging that they steered advisory clients, many of whom were retirees, into fixed index annuities that paid 7 or 8% commissions without adequately disclosing the conflict. Their advisory fees were about 1.5 or 2%. Cutter argued he was acting as an insurance agent, not as an advisor when selling those products. there was a motion to dismiss. The court ruled on the issue and it rejected the defense, holding that the Advisors Act fiduciary obligations govern the entire advisor-client relationship, not just the securities transactions. The case went to a jury. The jury, for whatever reason, delivered a split verdict, finding that Cutter and the firm were liable under negligence-based 2062, but not under the fraud Scienter-based 2061 or 2064. So the SEC didn't have to prove intentional misconduct, but negligent failures to disclose material conflicts were sufficient. There's been at least one other settlement that's similar. In September 2024, a firm and its principal were found to have provided TSP, thrift savings plan, rollover advice that was false or omitted material information. In that case, the firm steered federal employee clients into advisory IRAs, then used part of those assets to buy fixed life annuities from third-party carriers with commissions of 2 to 5%. And the firm failed to properly compare the TSP fees against the recommended alternatives, and the advisor just didn't document it. So similar to Cutter in a number of respects. And then folks on the call should know that there are a few open SEC investigations that are looking at similar types of issues that we saw in Cutter. So this issue is not going away.
All right. I'm seeing some very related questions to this particular case. Brian, if I could just throw a few questions out there your way. Um, in the Cutter case, was the RIA charging a fee on the FIA in addition to taking commission? Was that made clear at all?
I don't recall. Issa, I don't know if you remember that.
I don't recall off the top of my head, but the SEC did find that the advice nonetheless was within the scope of the investment advisory relationship. Um, and just to be clear, like for that, you know, for that finding to be made, there doesn't necessarily have to be like an advisory fee charged on the FIA. Um, the definition of investment advisor under the Advisors Act, it does have three elements: providing investment advice about securities for compensation, and that for compensation element is triggered by any form of compensation, whether it's an asset-based advisory fee, or some other indirect payment intended to be, remuneration for in exchange for that investment advice. So, like from that perspective, I'm not sure it would have been a dispositive fact.
Right.
I think,
Yeah,
yeah,
the
go ahead.
key thing is the failure to disclose the conflict there.
Right, right. And also, I mean, the SEC has acknowledged, that it's possible to scope certain types of services outside of the investment advisory relationship, right? But you do that through full and fair disclosure to the client such that they can provide informed consent to that scoping. And I think that's where Mr. Cutter went, where he, had an issue. He actually did the opposite. He had marketing on his website and other publicly available materials that presented the annuity related services as part of the overarching investment strategy that he was recommending. He called it like a three bucket strategy. So, if you're going to, you know, um, try to scope this out of the advisory relationship, it's important to ensure that clients understand, the capacity that you're acting when you're recommending that annuity product and the implications of it. Um, you know, there's a different standard of conduct that I'm held to. It's not the Advisors Act fiduciary duty. It's this other conduct, whether it's a state annuity suitability standard of conduct, or Reg BI, or whatever, and explain that, hey, that's not a fiduciary duty like the Advisors Act fiduciary duty. It only requires me to do X. Um, and there's SEC staff guidance around that's been around for some time. And if you're ever questioned, by an SEC examiner on that, you can point to that and do so in a fair way.
This is great. I think we're touching on something fairly juicy given the number of questions that are trickling in. Um, Selfishly, Issa, there is a common question that we get across our client base, and it's around the reasonable framework as it relates to investment advisors recommending annuity-like products.
Mm.
Does Reg BI apply? I'll pass the mic over to you before we're talking this.
Um, Sorry, Parn. So the question is, does Reg BI apply to?
So when recommending annuities, specifically in advisory accounts, I think you
Mhm.
touched on this a little bit earlier, but
Okay.
what's a reasonable framework for investment advisors who are recommending who are recommending annuities in advisory accounts?
Got it. Okay, understood. All right. So if you have the ability to choose from a brokerage versus an advisory version of the same product, I think the first thing to consider is which one is in the best interest of this client, given their investor profile information, particularly in light of whether they have a need for ongoing investment advice, whether they want their you know, assets within that annuity managed on an ongoing basis. Like for example, if it's a VA, do they want advice with respect to the allocation among the different sub-accounts within the VA, and are they willing to pay an ongoing advisory fee for those services? So that's the first consideration. Um, you know, Second, I'd say is if you've kind of gone down that line of looking toward an advisory version of the product, think through total cost, not just the advisory fee, but all the underlying costs. And is there a benefit to the client that would justify the total amount of fees that they would be paying? Obviously, you want to do a reasonably available alternatives consideration in that context, particularly given that you're dealing with costly products, products that are relatively complex. Think through, are there less costly options? Are there less complex options that can accomplish the same objective? Also recognize that if you do, an advisory version of this product, that you have an ongoing duty to monitor the product, and that obligates you to, reach out to the client to update their investment profile on an ongoing basis, periodic basis. Ensure that the product remains in their best interest, make any necessary updates to reflect any changes to their investor profile information. And then, a final point here, to the extent that you are a firm that's maybe looking to, absorb some other book of business that was written on a commission-based um, uh, version of a product, but absorb it into your advisory book of business. Other things to consider in that context are, how recently did those clients, pay a commission on those products? Just because if they've recently paid a commission and they're coming over to your firm and they're, um, going to be paying an advisory fee, is that an unreasonable amount of, fees that they're paying on the products? Particularly when it's this, if there's somebody at your firm who maybe earned the commission and then is going to stand to benefit from the advisory fee as well. So you could have those double dipping concerns. And then another thing to consider with that legacy business is broker-dealer status issues. So if those commission-based products are still paying trails on the original sale, you're going to have an issue with accepting those trails if you're not yourself registered as a broker-dealer. So figuring out a solution to that will be important in the event that you have some sort of transitioning book of business that does have the payment of those trails involved.
Amazing things for technology to solve, one would say. Thank you, Isa. I'm sure we'll come back to this. I see a bunch more questions coming in. Brian, I will not mention the case's name, but late last week, we heard about yet another major annuity-related FINRA enforcement matter. Looking at the details of that unnamed case, do you do you see any recurring patterns, and what can firms do to mitigate those particular issues?
Yes, and not as controversial as the previous named case. So last week, FINRA fined a firm $475,000 and a rep $10,000, a 12-month suspension, and there's a 600,000 plus customer restitution awarded. So in that case, FINRA found unjustified switching. The rep executed 88 variable annuity exchanges, moving customers from B share contracts that remained in their surrender periods into bonus share products with stepped up death benefit riders. And FINRA found insufficient analysis about whether the new product benefits outweighed the surrender charges, the longer holding periods, the higher fees, and the lost riders. So, sort of a classic annuity switching case with suitability and Reg BI issues. FINRA also found that the firm's supervisory system lacked effective exchange rate surveillance, including meaningful thresholds, designated reviewers, escalation procedures. So similar to all the things that we've been talking about. And then FINRA found also that customers were placed in commission-based B share annuities while paying advisory fees. So related to what we were just talking about, even though lower cost advisory share alternatives were available. So it's highlighting FINRA's concern about share class issues and the conflicts created from compensation. So the sort of key takeaway, it's the issues we've been talking about. And in addition, you can't just have disclosures, you can't just have basic forms, but you have to have some real analysis about why exchanges are in the best interest of the customers, and then demonstrating that the firm is performing an adequate review and there's supervisory review of the whole process.
Thanks, Brian. Um, I see lots more questions, folks. If you've got questions for our lovely panelists, please submit them. And we're coming up to time to unbelievably to tackle any of the questions that may come up. Maybe it's a good inflection point for me to jump in and actually ask for our third poll question, given the audience here, and given the conversation we've been having. So, what is your firm's biggest regulatory concern around annuity recommendations? I mean, you heard a lot about replacements and switches. Is it best interest and reasonably available alternative analysis? Isa, don't juice up the choices here this time around. Is it supervisory consistency, or is it the overlap of the regulatory expectations between SEC, FINRA, state? The list goes on.
Isa has a teleprompter with the answers on them.
Anybody want to take a guess before I share the results? No big risk takers in the.
I'll go for A and B again.
Yeah,
All
thank you
right.
for that.
It's A. Proving best interest and reasonably available alternatives, which I guess is the over-encompassing set of requirements I think that we've talked about today, right? All right. A few more questions before we pass it over to the lightning round for our lovely panelists. I'll stop calling you all lovely panelists. But uh, the third element of our agenda today is around capturing this opportunity. Clearly, there's growth, and everybody in the market's looking for organic growth opportunities. How do you build a scalable and defensible recommendation process is ultimately why we have gathered today. So, Rob, I won't even sort of jump into the preamble here. Um, What would you do if you were leading a wealth practice, which I know you are, to sort of support this point of recommendation around annuities?
So as a technology strategy consultancy, my answer is a little contrarian because I get approached all the time with firms wanting to make it easier and faster. Faster, easier, digital. Current firms keep buying speed, but what they should be buying, if you've been paying attention to the last 10 minutes, they should be buying evidence. I learned this the hard way supervising thousands of advisors across the NPH network. The transaction that hurts you is not the slow one, it's the undocumented one. So run back the tape you just heard. The 26 settlement was not whether the GLWB rider had value. It's that the principals had no framework to judge whether it was worth the permanently higher fee for that client. Another firm in Pittsburgh that paid 200 grand not so long ago was not for a bad product, but because nobody was watching the rate of exchanges, which 2330 explicitly requires. And every one of these, the product wasn't the violation, it was the file. Go back to Cutter real quick. Brian did a great job of laying that out. In 25, the jury cleared him of intentional fraud, but they found him liable anyway on negligence. He didn't have to be a villain. It's just that his disclosure wasn't good enough. The court also made clear that the Advisors Act fiduciary duty followed his advice, even though the FIA isn't a security. And the final judgment in February 26, get this, requires him to hand a copy of it to every client, existing and new, for 5 years. Imagine that, opening every prospect meeting with that document. So, what does a good decision support technology platform actually do? All right, Param, you know I'm good for an acronym. It does four things at the moment of recommendation. And since every one of these enforcement stories ends the same way, with the file being the problem, I'm going to make it super easy to remember. Build the FILE. F, full shelf data. You need to have structured product data on everything you could recommend, not just what the rep typed into the freeform text field on your Reg BA form. I, instant alternatives, an automatic side-by-side comparison of the reasonable available alternatives that links to your due diligence database and has rider level detail. L, loss math, surrender charges and foregone benefits quantified, not just narrated. E, exception flags on exchange patterns. Regulators keep telling us the file is the problem. So build the FILE. And the size of the prize for doing the comparison at all? Again, I'll go back to some DPL data recently. Their review tools analyzed over $1 billion of in-force contracts and reports, finding six figures of cost savings per contract on average. Discount the vendor math however you like. The order of magnitude tells you how much unexamined economics is sitting in the client books right now. The closing soundbite on this one, speed will save you minutes, but a good evidentiary file will save you the settlement.
So we now know what the F word is, I guess, Rob.
Nice. Well done. File. That's a good one. That's easy enough to remember, folks. Speaking of file, speaking of building that documentary evidence, Tom, obviously InvestorCom works with firms trying to scale that particular element of their practice. From your experience, what separates firms that scale annuity growth safely from those who are sort of going one fillable PDF at a time?
Yeah, I think what we're really trying to do, and I think it echoes a lot of, sort of Rob's point, is we're hearing firms ask us to help bake the kind of suitability rules into the recommendation process itself. Traditionally, this would be an application or a recommendation is made and it goes to a supervisory team and it comes back, and there's really frustration from the suitability team on all these sort of non-good order applications. And then there's frustration from the advisors on this back and forth and really a lack of clarity on what the rules are and the suitability checks are. And so we think that if you bake all the suitability rules and the right data analysis into the recommendation process, and make the compliant path the default, this unlocks sort of this scaling and this growth that we're talking about today, and is a huge sort of emphasis on folks we talk to these days, specifically around the annuity process. And I think just quickly, the second anecdote is obviously the things mentioned around automatic, reasonably available alternatives and detailed sort of exchange analysis are obviously kind of core. You have to make sure you have the right technology um, to enable these checks.
Thanks, Tom. Very efficient response, similar to InvestorCom's technology. Isa, for firms building out this element of their practice for the first time or expanding an existing but manual process, what's the first structural decision, in your opinion, that tends to go wrong?
I could see one thing that could create some complexity here, being the patchwork of regulation out there. Um, there's been some consolidation of the regulation at the state level with a couple of notable exceptions, like New York Reg 187 is a big one that requires, certain particularized disclosure to be delivered to, consumers and the documentation of certain, bases for the recommendation. But beyond the state level, there's overlay from Reg BI, from the Advisors Act fiduciary duty, even from ERISA and PTE 2020-02. So building a process that takes that patchwork into account from the very beginning, I think is very important. And just catering to the lowest common denominator whenever you can, whenever it's appropriate, in your supervisory process will save you a lot of headache, especially if you do it early on and you're not having to go back and build around that.
Thanks, Isa. One more quick question for you, Rob, and then maybe we can jump into the questions we'll be getting from our audience. And folks, if you've got questions, the raise hand feature, we won't be able to unmute you. Please submit any question via your Zoom chat box. Rob, Tom touched on NIGO rates. We hear it quite often across our client base. Advisors about to make a recommendation, goes through the whole suitability process, makes an investment recommendation or a proposal to their end investor, and after the fact, somebody comes back and says, "Oh, you cannot recommend this annuity rider combination." Any advice there?
Well, I get this question from firms all the time. Should I be spending my money in my AOE process on the point of sale to get rid of NIGO? Should I do it on the comparison and alternative step, or should I do it on the back end in supervisory review? Where do I get the best ROI? And after you go through this, you realize it's the comparison and alternative step, and it's not even close. So let me explain with a war story. At our firm, NIGO was a thing that quietly ate our ops budget because paper annuity apps back in the day ran as high as 60% NIGO. Heckscher has the same exact data. And the replacement paperwork, all the 2330 forms were the worst of it. And that was for us sometimes up to 70% of all of our VA activity. But here's the thing, that problem is pretty much solved. The modern e-app platforms run NIGO rates above 90% or in good order rates above 90%. And the industry just proved a fully digital 1035 in production from Athene to Jackson. Shout out to IRI's Digital First initiative. If you're not familiar, IRI Digital First. But that cut a transfer from weeks to a day. So NIGO is going down. It went from a strategy problem to now just a checkbook problem. Buy it, don't build it, move on. Supervisory review, though, that's downstream. If the comparison never happened, your principal's reviewing a beautifully signed, fully in good order file that still fails Reg BI. The comparison step is the only place in the workflow where best interest is actually formed. And it produces the very artifact that the sale, the supervision, and one day the exam is all going to run on. So check the scorecard. We talked about, 3 cases. I could add the RILA sweep. Every annuity action of the last couple of years is a comparison, surveillance, or disclosure failure, not a NIGO one. No firm has ever been fined for a NIGO. Firms pay 6 or 7 figures for missing comparisons, though. So invest where the liability is.
That was an excellent point. Ideally, NIGO is resolved, comparison of alternatives is resolved, and this exchange quagmire that everyone's been talking about has been resolved as well, along with being able to natively mitigate a lot of the conflicts that Brian and Isa eloquently touched on today. Folks, I've seen questions come through the wire here. Is there a compliance template that includes all of this? We've tried to provide an element to this. You'll get a survey at the end of today's session. We can touch on it. Let me just kind of go quickly to show you what you can expect following today's session. There are a few other questions. I'm just going to quickly stream through this. There was a question earlier on as we were speaking about the Cutter case, and there was someone who missed specifically the element of conflict. Um, could we just double click on that just to make sure we address that particular question? Where was the conflict in the Cutter case? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, the conflict was that they were making the commissions on the sales of the fixed products a lot more than they were making in terms of the advisory products. And then there were some other statistics that I saw when I was looking at them. So there was $9.34 million in commissions that were earned. In terms of the annuity replacements, 34 of them were made before there was a surrender period had expired. There was $640,000 in surrender charges. So there were a variety of issues that weren't adequately disclosed.
Thank you, Brian. One more quick question. I hope we have enough time for this. Thank you all for sticking around with us. If the insurance carrier is the one paying for the commission, not the client, does the commission amount still need to be disclosed to the client?
Yes, there are state laws that require disclosure of the fact of compensation. In some cases, some states require even more detail than that. Like a good example of that is New York Regulation 194. But yes, in general, even if you're dealing with a fixed product, a fixed annuity product, there is a disclosure obligation with respect to compensation. And I'll also mention if you're dealing with a security like a variable annuity or a RILA, from a Reg BI perspective, under Reg BI's disclosure obligation, there's an obligation there to disclose to the retail customer, in at least in general terms, what kind of compensation you would earn in terms of the commission.
Right. And the issue is it creates an incentive.
Hmm.
So it is material.
Hmm.
There it is. Folks, we're at time. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists, Brian, Isa, Rob, and Tom. Thank you very much for making time. And for folks whose questions we were not able to address, we'll follow up with you and take up any other thoughts you might have. Thank you, everyone.